This is Jay Watts from Merely Human Ministries. This is the Human Things Podcast episode, or season 3, episode 9. And that number is confirmed.
3, 2, 1.
Here we go!
Hey, welcome to the Human Things Podcast, season 3, episode 9. The order's been crazy. We had a lost episode, so we went from 7 and 8, which are actually 6 and 7 as far as they were released, and then episode 6, or what we called episode 6-ish, was released as episode 8. And here's if you watch, which you should watch, because you're missing Pops if all you're doing is listening to it. And you know, sometimes Lisa does some really cool things that she adds visually. I like it. I give her a license, be as weird as you want to be. I'm fine. I don't take myself that seriously. But also, the reason we were able to find episode 6 was because I was wearing a Speed Racer t-shirt. Shannon, who, by the way, is not a woman, he wanted me to make that clear. Shannon is my web guy. And Shannon was, when we were looking for episode 6 and trying to figure out what happened, he sent me a picture of me wearing a Speed Racer t-shirt and asked me if that was a different episode. He hadn't seen that t-shirt. So if you watch the show, you'll notice that I've been wearing different t-shirts every week. That is entirely because Shannon has told me it's a lot easier for him on his side to differentiate between the different episodes based on the t-shirt that I'm wearing. So I ran out and bought a couple other different t-shirts. Today I'm wearing Snoopy with Wander on it. So we're going to have to keep that up. I'm trying to help Shannon out by wearing a different t-shirt every time. So we found 6. 6 came after 7 and 8. Now we're on 9. Way back on episode 8, which was 7, we said I was going to do a talk about late-term abortion this week and discuss. I'm going to bump that to the last episode of season 3, which we'll be filming shortly, because there was just some things happened this week. I have no animal stories this week. Nothing exciting to talk about there. There was a report of monkeys that they've now identified a group of monkeys that have names, but we already talked about names with the elephants, and it would just be rehashing the same technology and the same story just being applied to monkeys. In reality, this is just going to be a thing. Now that we're able to analyze language or analyze sounds faster and associate them with movement or identify them with reaction from animals, we're just going to find out that more animals have names than we thought, and that list is going to grow. It is. It's not going to get huge, but it is going to get longer. We've already covered that. So let's talk about the things we are going to cover. Number 1, in the pro-life community, things sort of blew up in the last week. And the week prior to me filming this particular episode, things blew up because candidate Donald Trump said that he would not support, were he president of the United States, he would not support a 6-week ban on abortion if Republicans were able to pass a 6-week ban, a ban that said that after 6 weeks, after a heartbeat is detected, after we know that there's a life there, nationally, would he support that? And he said, no, he would not. As a president, he would veto it, which is different, by the way. We've talked before on this show, and then I've written it for Christian Research Journal, done interviews for this online with groups like Issues, Etc., and Postmodern Realities podcast, where we've talked about the idea of a party platform that is hostile towards your views if you're a pro-life Christian or just a pro-life person. The Democratic Party's platform, which, by the way, when they sent out their, as a side note, when they put out their completed Democratic platform, their actual official platform for the Democratic Party's election, they didn't edit out the parts where they were talking about President Biden and his second term. They had weeks before the convention, and they had to approve this. All they had to do was go through and edit out a few points to recognize that Kamala Harris was now the candidate and not President Biden. Vice President Kamala Harris, in her first term, when she was going to do all these things, they didn't do it out. That strikes me as being so weirdly lazy in a presidential election cycle. But I'm about to make the case in a second here, after we talk about this first thing, that this is, without question, the dumbest election cycle of my life. And that is irrespective of which party you're supporting. But we'll talk about that in a second. Right now, let's go back to what I was talking about. The pro-life community kind of blew up a little bit. And it started with President Trump, or former President Trump, saying that he would not support that kind of a federal ban on abortion. He believes he did his job. He returned it to the states. That's where it belongs. And he thinks, in his own words, 6 weeks is too early. He's said these sorts of things before. So, Lila Rose, and full disclosure, I don't know Lila. I've never even met her. I've been at events where I think we were both speaking separately. She would, main stage here. I would come up later, maybe hours later. Our paths have crossed professionally, but I've never actually met her. And I'm not a huge consumer of live action. She is the head of live action, but I do recognize that she is a force. I mean, one of the main forces and personalities within the pro-life movement. I'm never comfortable with the idea of pro-life celebrities. I think that's a weird thing. The idea that somebody became famous for this. But if there are pro-life celebrities, and certainly there are, relatively speaking. I mean, she's not like Taylor Swift or anything like that, but within the pro-life community, Lila Rose is probably about as big as you get and is probably as beloved as you get within the pro-life community. Lila Rose came out and said that former President Trump is not working for the pro-life community. He's not trying in any way to court our vote. He's not in any way communicating to those people who care about this issue that he's on our side and that he's going to be fighting for us. And so she said, by extension, she sees no reason to promise him her vote. That if he continues to say the things that he's saying and communicate what he's saying to the pro-life community, not just that he doesn't care, because not caring, apathy is one thing, but that he would actively work against legislation to protect life, then she doesn't owe him her vote. That's what she said. Now, she didn't say, I categorically will never vote for him. She said, unless he amends his language, I won't vote for him. Now, whether you agree with that or not, and a lot of pro-lifers disagree with it because they see the hostility of the Democratic platform versus the apathy or the agnosticism or whatever of the Republican platform, or even now, even with President Trump or former President Trump modifying his language and taking a position where he's actively working against pro-life legislation, hypothetically, when he's asked the question, they say, in something like, I know Greg Kokel, the president and founder of Stand to Reason, had a saying that I believe he would rather have, in the case if he was fighting a fire, he would rather have a third-rate fireman than a first-rate arsonist. If we're trying to put out a fire, he said, give me the third-rate fireman over the first-rate arsonist. And so many people are defending voting for Trump on those grounds. Kristen Hawkins, the president of Students for Life America, came out very critical of what Mr. Trump said. Very critical of what he said, but then landed in the position of saying, I'm still going to vote for him, going back to Greg Kokel, something like that argument. I would rather, if we're fighting a fire, I would rather have a third-rate fireman than a first-rate arsonist on my side. So I think, by the way, that her position, both Lila Rose's position and Kristen Hawkins' position are completely understandable, reasonable, rational responses to the environment that we find ourselves in. I think that there's nothing wrong with going to somebody who wants to represent you as president of the United States and saying, I don't like what you're saying. This issue is this is the most important issue for me because I believe that the unborn are fully human. And so I'm looking for a candidate that will both recognize that humanity and the evil of abortion, just as if I had lived back in 1858, and we're going to be talking about that in a second. If I lived back in 1858, I might take the slavery issue just as seriously because I recognize that African slaves moved here to the United States and held as property are fully human and ought to be treated with the same dignity and respect that any other human being ought to be treated with. And so I would see that issue as being so important that I'm less interested in how you're going to deal with other issues where possibly the differences between the two of you on policy just really isn't that big of a deal. Those are differences of grade, right? You believe one thing, I believe another. We have the same goals, but we have different ideas about how to reach those goals. Ultimately, and that's the way I feel like the party split was more like when I was a child. When I was younger, I felt like that was the environment that we lived in. We had two different parties that had a similar vision for what they wanted America to be, that had a similar vision of the results that they wanted for America, but they had different ideas about how to get them. And they were fighting about the way to achieve certain goals, but there were a lot of shared principles. That's really not the case any longer. You're talking about two different views of what America ought to be, two different views about what human beings are, two different views about how we define our relationships with society. We have seen this diverge greatly. And if there's any movement at all, it's always more of it moving towards more progressive ideas. Even for the conservative side is constantly moving more towards progressivism. The middle is moving constantly, and it's always moving to the left. And if you don't believe me, go look at the policies that Democratic presidents, even Barack Obama in his first term, was saying, what he was looking to platform. Look at what Bill Clinton platformed. Look at what even people today that are progressive icons, look at the kind of things that they were seeking as Democratic representatives even just 20, 30 years ago. So there's been a shift, right? And so it makes sense for somebody who looks at the world right now and says, look, my main thing is abortion. Just like their main thing would have been back then slavery. This is a great evil. This is what I care about more than anything else. And if you don't care about it anymore, I don't owe you my support. That's a reasonable position to hold. It may not be the greatest way to fight abortion. It may be, I don't know. I don't have an answer for that because I can't see the future and because I don't really think consequentially. I don't think that's a great way to work out public morality. What I ultimately think will be the best for all people or produce the results that I'm most interested in is my job, as I see it, is different and how I understand good and bad and my role within it. But I think both Kristen Hawkins' response and Lila Rose's responses are perfectly legitimate responses. In reaction to that, some zealous supporters of Mr. Trump scoured GuideStar, 990s, public information about these ministries or these organizations, found out how much Kristen and Lila Rose and people like them make, and then made it public on Twitter, or X, I'm sorry, and then attacked them as grifters. That was a lot, calling Lila a grifter, that she was out there trying to take advantage of people, which by the way, let's go back to, again, it's perfectly legitimate to demand that your candidates answer for their policies if they are wanting to win your vote. Here's another thing that I think is perfectly legitimate. Asking people in ministry to explain why they make the money that they make and the results that they're getting. I honestly think that asking people in the pro-life movement, leaders like Kristen Hawkins and Lila Rose, any of us that have been working in the pro-life movement for the last couple of decades, people have been working in it for decades. I think it's perfectly fair at this point, because of the losses that we're seeing on the state level, to look at us and say, to look at everybody and say, are you winning? Is this working? Does your plan impact the world positively on the issue of abortion? I think we have a lot to answer for. And I think it's fair to have this discussion. But I also think that it's very American to look at things in very small windows and to make broad sweeping generalizations about how things are going based on very small windows of time, and that we need to see larger movement before we can make those determinations. But I think it's both fair for Lila Rose, Kristen Hawkins, and for anybody else to question Donald Trump about what he's doing right now. I think it's eminently fair for Lila Rose to say, you don't get my vote if you don't represent me. I think it's fair for people to turn back around and say, how much money do you make, and can you justify making that much money? And I think it's fair to say, is the pro-life movement effective? And is the current strategies working? And what can we do better? Because the ultimate end is not to produce pro-life celebrities. The ultimate end is to produce results that end up in saving lives. But to call them a grifter and to question their character without knowing them, that's just ad hominem nonsense. And we should be better than that. We should. And that particular thing bugged me. Every human being ought to be questioned. All of us. None of us should rise so far above everyone else that you shouldn't be allowed to question what we're doing and why we're doing the things. and ask us what our motivations are. Ask us to justify the things that we're doing, and for us to be able to put forward evidence that we're actually trying to accomplishing anything that we set out to accomplish. Ask us to justify what we make in ministry. I think that's perfectly fair. And asking how much is too much or how much is enough is a perfectly fair question. But grifter goes too far, because there is no evidence at all that we're talking about people who are motivated by anything else other than a passionate belief that all human beings ought to be treated with dignity and respect, and have devoted their entire lives to fighting that. And you have no idea the hate that they get for doing that. Nobody hates pro-life women more than the other. It is crazy the way pro-life women are attacked. Far more than pro-life men. The attacks against their character. The attacks against them personally. So these are people that have placed themselves out there for years to draw criticism on this view and to question their heart and their motivations, question their effectiveness, question their money, question all those things, question it fairly, ask them, let them give an account of themselves, but don't attack their character. That's just beneath all reasonable people and how we ought to communicate on these things. So that's one thing. Oh, I hated that. I don't fight with pro-lifers because I hate it. Because if you're out there fighting pro-life, or if you're out there fighting the abortion issue, then you're doing good work. And I may not be the way that I do it, but it's not my business to tell you how to do it. And if I disagree with the way you're doing it, I may talk to you privately, but there'll never be a public conversation between you and I where I try to undercut you. C.S. Lewis talked about the idea of, as a Christian, that every once in a while we have unfortunate supporters, is what he called them. People who are on our side, but who make us look bad sometimes by association because they do things in a wildly different way than we would, or they say things that we think are crazy. And we don't want to be associated with them, but if they're on our side, they're on our side. And they're still our supporters. And we have to recognize that unfortunate supporters ought not to be undermined or undercut to win the approval of the people who disagree with us. We are all still fighting on the same side. This is not a question of degree. The people who disagree with us on the other side of this issue, it's a difference of kind versus a difference of degree. The unfortunate supporter is a difference of degree. We believe the same things, but we just have different ideas about how to accomplish those goals. The other people are a difference of kind in the sense that they are looking for a world radically different from the world that we're fighting for. All right, so I don't fight with abortion foes. I don't fight with pro-life people. I don't argue or bicker with them, but I did want to address that because it is a big thing that's going on, and it's just ugly. That's ugly. Number two thing that I wanted to address before we get into this, I mentioned it earlier. We are living in what I believe is possibly the dumbest election cycle in the history of the United States. I've come to that conclusion. And I don't mean that I think that these are the dumbest candidates who've ever run for office. I'm not saying that. And I don't mean that let's say what I do mean. All right, let's just start there. I'm not, it's just not an attack against them. I'm not saying that they're just terrible candidates. We'll leave that aside for the moment. The question of the value of their candidates. This election cycle is unquestionably, to me, the dumbest election cycle we've ever been through. And here's why. Because this is the most low information election cycle I've ever seen in my life. There's a lot of things contributing to that. Number one, let's start with just the general distrust that people have for the media right now. There are no trusted news sources that everybody can gather around. There was a Monk. I don't know if you watched the Monk debates, listened to the Monk debates. Have you ever heard of the Monk debates? JD's shaking his head. No. Okay, if you go online and find the Monk debates. I like the Monk debates. It's an organization out of Canada, I believe, and they set up debates. And here's how the Monk debates work. You poll people that are coming in the audience on a particular issue. You tell this is the point that's going to be debated tonight. Where do you land on this? And then they choose people to represent each side. And then they have their debate on stage. And then after, they poll people and they see if there was a shift. Did the audience go one way or another? And if it went one way or another, then those people won the debate. Whoever brought more people to their side, whoever had the biggest shift towards them, they won the debate. And so there was a debate on the trust in media. I found out about this particular Monk debate, but I was listening to Malcolm Gladwell as I was driving across the country. I sort of enjoy his podcast. I used to enjoy it more, but I sort of enjoy Malcolm Gladwell's podcast, Revisionist History, and I was listening to it, and he was talking about when he went on the Monk debates to talk about whether or not the media could be trusted, or whether or not mainstream media was trustworthy. And one of the people that it was Malcolm Gladwell was one of the two representing his side, and one of the two people representing the other side was Douglas Murray. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Douglas Murray. He is a conservative homosexual from England and is just wicked smart. His book's The Madness of Crowd, and I think it's like, I can't remember the exact name of it, The Strange Death of Europe or something like that. But those books are wonderful as far as his articulation of his point of view. He reminds me of, and I mean this as a compliment, because of Christopher Hitchens when I first encountered him, who was most famous during the last few years of his life as an atheist, but he was a very polemical, conservative writer when I first encountered him, and I enjoyed that about him. I would never communicate the way he did, but there's a bluntness to the way that he does communicated, and a clarity in the way that he addressed certain issues that didn't later, I think, carry over as much into his arguments about religion, where I felt like he was not as strong. Although the strength of that personality came through, and I think was what made him such a powerful rhetorical force, even in that debate. You saw it fall apart more when he got into more academic ground, like when he debated William Lane Craig, which is a terrible debate for him. Not for Craig, but for Christopher Hitchens. Douglas Murray has that same concision to me, somebody who just is able to get right to the point. Douglas Murray, and I can't remember his debate partner against Malcolm Gladwell, and I can't remember his debate partner. Malcolm Gladwell lost worse than anybody has ever lost before, trying to argue the point that the mainstream media was still trustworthy. It was the worst loss in the history of the Monk debates. He has an entire episode of Revisionist History where he's talking about why he did so poorly. He doesn't understand why he did so poorly. It was that Douglas Murray was right and he was wrong. And at this point, though, we have to understand, as it pertains to this election cycle, it's a low information election cycle, number one, because nobody trusts the media. There's no media source that anybody trusts. And so what do we do when we don't trust media sources? We tend to look for for confirmation bias. We go for the places that are saying the things that we want to hear said. So that's number one reason it's a low information news election cycle. Number two reason is that we are largely an illiterate society. And that sounds more insulting than, it's hard for that not to be insulting, but let's give some facts, right? These are coming from the National Literacy Institute. These are their facts on adult literacy in the United States. On average, 79% of U.S. adults nationwide are literate. So almost 80% can read. That's good news, right? 80% can read. Compared to world history, that's great news. Throughout human history, there just haven't been this level of literacy. But 54% of adults have a literacy rate below sixth grade level. So 54% of the literate adults in the United States are reading at or below a sixth grade level. Now, good news is that the sixth grade level covers a lot of interesting things. I think the Chronicles of Narnia operated as I looked it up. I was like, okay, what does that mean? Because I didn't want to just laugh at the number. I'm like, oh, they're all so stupid. No, I looked it up, and it's like the Chronicles of Narnia, the Harry Potter series is a sixth grade level, the Hunger Games. So it's not like they can't read. They can read pretty big books. A couple of those books are larger books. I asked an expert, I said, what does this mean when they say they can read at a sixth grade level? What are we talking about? Because these books, The Giver, these aren't books that I think are stupid books. They can clearly read. And this person who has degrees in education, has worked for years in elementary education, and now is an AP teacher in high school on history, and has taught AP government, and has taught a wide range of, and it's also, by the way, just happens to be my wife, full disclosure, but she's an expert in this field, both by her education and profession. So what does that mean? Sixth grade level. And she said, it means that they can read, they can understand a narrative flow, they can understand the different characters are being introduced, but it lacks a complexity. It lacks an ability to understand or process complex ideas. There's a basic level at which they can interact with information, and then they can follow larger narratives and character development. But there's a level of complexity that's absent from them. So that's 54% of the adult population of the United States, at best, reading at a sixth grade level. which means that they can understand what's going on and they can understand all the parties involved, but they lack the ability to read and associate what's going on with complex ideas. And the problem is there's very few jobs in the world that are going to deal with more complexity than the President of the United States. It's all about complexity. This isn't a job that you can just give to anybody. So number one is we have low information because, number one, people don't trust their news sources anymore. And so confirmation bias is becoming an increasing problem. Number two, because we just don't have a very literate society. So we say 54%, 20% are below fifth grade level. So of the 54% that are reading at a sixth grade level that are literate, so half of the people, or 54% of the adult population are reading at a sixth grade or below level, 20% are below a fifth grade level. That's alarming. That's of the literate people, right? So 54% have a literacy below, and that's of all people. So when we're talking about the 80% that can read, 54% so of all people reading in a sixth grade or below, and 20% reading below fifth grade. So over half the population or half the population is reading, but they're reading at a lower rate than sixth grade level or below. That's a little alarming. So that leaves of the next 34% of adults lacking literacy proficiency were born outside of the U.S. So 34% of the people who can't read were born outside. A third of the people who can't read were born outside of the U.S. So it's not a particularly literate or deep or complex group of people right now that we're talking about as a whole in the United States. So we have news sources that we can't trust. We have a group of people where half the population can't understand complex ideas, even if they can follow along with what's going on, and can't process that information, at least not typographically. And that's what this, but there's a book called Neil Postman, or not called Neil Postman, written by Neil Postman, Amusing Ourselves to Death. It's an old book, A Public Discourse in the Age of Show Business. Here it is right here. And this is considered one of the great works in understanding the way that people think and the trouble that will ultimately arise. Understand, this was written decades ago about television, but everything that he talks about in this book, you have seen it manifest itself even more intensely in the digital age that we live in right now. But he's talking about the switch from a typographical society to an image-based society, a society where everybody first and foremost gets their information from reading to where people get it from watching, which is a much more passive and emotional form. And so, watching me, I want you to read his description in chapter 4 of this book, the beginning of it. He's talking about Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas' series of debates in 1858, where both of them were running for a U.S. Senate seat in the state of Illinois. So if you can get a sense of what it used to be like to try to get a political office in the United States versus today. The first of the 7 famous debates between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas took place on August 21st, 1858 in Ottawa, Illinois. Their arrangement provided that Douglas would speak first for 1 hour. Lincoln would take an hour and a half to reply. Douglas, a half hour to rebut Lincoln's reply. This debate was considerably shorter than those which the two men were accustomed. In fact, they had tangled several times before, and all of their encounters had been much lengthier and more exhausting. For example, on October 16th, 1854, in Peoria, Illinois, Douglas delivered a 3-hour address to which Lincoln, by agreement, was to respond. When Lincoln's turn came, he reminded the audience that it was already 5 p.m. and that he would probably require as much time as Douglas, and that Douglas was still scheduled for a rebuttal. He proposed, therefore, that the audience go home, have dinner, and return, refreshed for 4 more hours of talk. The audience amiably agreed, and matters proceeded as Lincoln had outlined. When 2 people were running for political office at the time of Abraham Lincoln, they had hours to present their case to an audience live. And then the other person had hours to respond. And then they had the opportunity to question those candidates. The level and depth of understanding of the candidate that's running before you between that time and today is astonishing. Let's talk about the two candidates running for office today. We have one candidate who has not run for office, but was named the candidate of their party because the current sitting president did so poorly in a debate that they had to step down. And at the time, no one else felt confident to step in and take on Donald Trump, who was riding a wave of popularity after the assassination attempt on his life. She has never won a primary. She has spent her entire, if you believe the reports that you hear, she has spent her entire time as vice president avoiding public engagements where she was going to be asked questions directly by the audience. There were even reports that she refused to go to do certain events, and the White House had to send lower level officials to those events because she didn't want to be put in front of an audience where she was going to be put under pressure of questions. Saying that seems unfair. That's hearsay. Okay, well, for the first month and a half of her candidacy for president of the United States, she's had 0 press conferences. Does that sound like somebody that's really feeling confident? At the time that I'm recording this, we're into the end of the first week of September. She's had 0 press conferences and 1 interview where she was accompanied by her vice presidential candidate, a running mate, where they had control of the environment and the questions that were going to be asked. She's had no debate, no pressure, no questions, has never won a primary. We don't have the slightest idea who this person is. Right now, a photograph of Kamala Harris is running for president. And her supporters are crazy enthusiastic about this idea. They are so happy to have her running. But we're not allowed to ask her anything. Not yet. Not yet. Okay. Is the Republican side any better? As a conservative, let's say the guy that we are currently running for president didn't show up for a single primary debate. Not a single one. He never stepped on the stage with the people who are running against him and allowed us to hear him in open debate. Never. And as his reward for refusing to debate, we put him right in there. We gave him, some of the excuses are, well, he was in a trial. He was being prosecuted for felonies in multiple states. He was fighting for his life legally. And unfair, unjust is what they'll tell us. Unjust prosecutions. Even some of the defenses, though, for some of the things that he's being prosecuted for are weak. I'm not saying that prosecutions were just. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying for is the people who are put in position to defend him are saying things that I think that they probably wouldn't say under normal circumstances in defense of this. So we have 2 candidates. And the only debate that former President Trump has participated in is the now famous worst debate in the history of the world, where Biden was so awful that he lost his candidacy and was given to Kamala Harris. We don't know anything about these candidates and the positions they hold right now because they're not talking to us about them. They're not engaging in debate. They're not leaving themselves open to be questioned. Nothing like a political body that insisted that these people speak for hours and hours in front of them, engaging their ideas and having some idea about what they will do and the minutia of their policy. Who is this person in front of me? The level of sophistication that was being operated at when you were talking about the knowledge of those candidates that they had back then versus now. And by the way, I have been hypercritical about this in every election that we've had in the past few election cycles. when you would have people whose whole job it was, when former President Trump was engaging in debate, and we would have 10 or 12 Republican primary candidates up there, and they would get maybe 3 or 4 minutes in the entire time that we had a debate, and the entire goal that they had during that 3 or 4 minutes was not to say something stupid. They were doing their best not to sabotage themselves by saying something stupid. So what they did was say nothing, said nothing. The goal is to not look bad on camera, not to give us anything substantive about you so that we know who we're voting for, but not to say something stupid so we have some reason to cast you out. And look at how Marco Rubio's campaign broke down because of a few bad seconds on stage when he was pushed by Chris Christie 2 elections ago. When he just broke. And suddenly this lifetime politician who had all of this goodwill behind him, this young, dynamic politician, this Republican that people thought was the future of the party, had a few bad minutes on television and it was done. Aaron Sorkin has a line in his book, in his movie, The American President, that he wrote, where they talk about that FDR would never have been elected president in our current environment because he had a wheelchair. And this current environment would never elect a president with a wheelchair. Now, you may not like FDR. You may be one of those historians who hate what he did with the New Deal. But what they're saying is that one of the greatest presidential figures, love him or hate him, that has ever existed, couldn't even win the office today because the optics on him are bad. So why is this the dumbest election that we've ever experienced? Because we have news sources we don't trust. We have a low information voting base who demands nothing of the people that they're willing to elect, except that they not be the other side. And we demand nothing from them. Going back to what Lila Rose was saying, I think it's perfectly reasonable for her to go to somebody running for president of the United States who's asking for their vote and to say, why would I vote for you when you're not representing my views? Moderate your position on this, change how you're talking about it, and you get my vote. As a matter of fact, I think Frederick Douglass is one of the greatest Americans who's ever lived, and he did the same thing with Lincoln. He attacked Lincoln publicly, repeatedly, for his position on slavery, for not being strong enough as far as declaring the rights of slaves, for his willingness to let slavery exist if it meant peace. Because Lincoln actually said those things in public speeches and writing, that he wanted a union. And if keeping slavery was necessary to preserve the union, he was willing to do that in that first election. And Frederick Douglass was wildly critical of that. Even though Lincoln was a better candidate than the pro-slavery candidates he was running against, Frederick Douglass insulted that view and said, why would I ever support somebody who doesn't recognize my basic humanity enough to be against slavery? I'm not saying Lila Rose is Frederick Douglass, but I'm saying she's doing nothing different than what Frederick Douglass did. She's demanding something of the person running for office beyond just don't be a Democrat. This is the dumbest election cycle I have ever lived through in my life, because we have never known less about the candidates. They've never made themselves less available to be questioned. They've never made themselves less available for debate. We have a snapshot of one and a history of another, and that's what's running against each other. Your picture versus your history, and the fact that you represent two different parties. And we have a low information voter base that's not demanding more. The single dumbest election that I have ever seen in my entire life. We ought to be better than that. The United States ought to be better. We ought to demand more from the people running for office than that they be good at fighting each other. What a load of garbage. I don't need you to be a great fighter. I don't need you to be the most ugly person, the person willing to go the lowest. What I need for you to do is to be a principled human being that will take office and fight for the flourishing of our community through good policy. Demand that they have a deep understanding of that policy and that they represent themselves the way that we would want the people to represent ourselves. Throw them all out as far as I'm concerned. Find good people. But this election cycle ought to be a shame on the people of the United States, because we've made no demands on the people running for office, and we're cheering them on as they refuse to talk to us every step of the way. Yikes. All right. So I don't know how many people are going to hate me after that. That's okay. I have been called a harbinger of the Antichrist before. I was actually asked to comment on. I was contacted after I wrote an article for an organization that said, "Would you like to respond to criticisms you received?" So, what criticisms? Well, they sent me one, and it's like, "This man is the harbinger of the Antichrist." Like, I have no response to that. I don't even know what I'm supposed to say. You know, I have a high standard for people who run for president of the United States, and I believe that everybody in the United States should. And I think that the current process that we're going through is something like a depressing joke. If it would be a joke, if the ramifications for being wrong weren't so terrible, and if the cost for being wrong weren't so horribly high, we need to be high information voters requiring a great deal from the people running for office, a great deal more than just that they be Democrat or Republican. And electable. I hate the concept of electability. So stupid. All right, so let's move on from that. The final thing I want to talk about today, and this is going to be kind of not an experiment, but we're going to go through this quickly. It's one of the things, as we talk about the idea that the pro-life position has become unpopular, so unpopular that the Republicans are running away from it some bit, and that the pro-life party, pro-life Americans don't really have a home in any particular party right now. If we're talking about a place where people look at us and say, we agree with what's important to you and we're fighting for you. So we have to take the objections seriously. By the way, Scott Klusendorf's second edition for The Case for Life is coming out. It's out right now. You can purchase it and buy it. I think that it is providential that the way that the process went for publication took as long as it did, so that we're getting it now at a time where it is most needed. Scott's book is the best book I have ever read. And I've read the second edition. I've read the first edition many times. I worked with Scott. Scott and I are friends. But I'm telling you that if you want to teach the pro-life position, if you want to communicate the pro-life position, Scott's books are the greatest books out there on that particular issue. The book, The Case for Life, the second edition, is out right now, and I encourage everybody who takes this issue seriously and wants to be able to talk to other people about it and wants to be able to teach this issue versus understanding it at a complex level, being able to talk and teach it to other people, read that book. That said, one of the objections that we're going to have to answer, we're going to have to start answering everybody's objections again. We have to go back to teaching. We have to go back to making our case. So somebody comes up to me and they say, and I've heard this a lot, you will never stop abortion. Even if you make it illegal, you will never stop abortion. It's always been here. It always will be here. Why do you want to make it illegal when it won't stop it? Fair. That's a fair question. So let's talk about why. And let's try to break this down into category. And after, by the way, we record this episode, I'm going to write this portion up as well, or something like this, and I'm going to put it on our Substack. I'll post it at our website. I'll post it at Facebook. We'll post it on X. We'll post it on Instagram, everywhere, so that you can find our Substack and go and read it. If you want the information I'm going to be talking about here, this section will be on our Substack for free. We're not charging for it. So the question is, why fight to make it illegal if you're never going to stop it? It's always been there. It always will be. Okay, how do we answer that? First is to recognize that the most important question when we're talking about the issue of abortion is, what is the unborn? What is the embryonic human being? What is the fetal human being? Is it one of us? If we all agree that it's wrong to kill other human beings without great justification, which most people still do, that's objectively wrong for all people at all times, just go around killing other human beings. We can't kill human beings because they're inconvenient. We can't do that. We recognize that. So the question is the embryonic or fetal human one of us? Does it fall in the category of human beings that we can't kill because they're inconvenient? Well, how do we argue for that? We argue using the science of embryology that tells us biologically human life begins at the moment of fertilization. The second they come into existence as a single-celled organism, a zygote, that early embryonic human life is a whole distinct and living whole and distinct human life. It has its own genetic destiny that is pursuing through a growth and maturation process that is dictated by the information that exists in itself. It is a distinct and whole living human entity. It is a human life from the moment it comes into existence. And then we argue philosophically the best explanation of our shared concept of equal human dignity, this idea that all human beings throughout all of humanity have equal value, that it's wrong to kill or murder or rape steal from, displace people all over the world, no matter what culture, no matter what your laws, no matter what your religious beliefs are. There are just ways we should treat human beings. And if we believe in this concept of equal dignity that transcends culture and law, then we ground that value in something that we all share equally. And there's only one thing that we all share equally, that's our shared humanity. So we're human from the moment that we come into existence, and we ground our equal dignity, our equal value, our equal rights in our shared humanity, because it's the only thing we all have equal amounts of. And so from that position, the argument then goes that the unborn is one of us from the moment it comes into existence. And we owe it the same basic duty and obligations that we owe to any other life. So if that's true, then it doesn't matter that we can't completely end abortion by making it illegal. Just like we can't completely end murder by making murder illegal. We can't completely end rape by making rape illegal. We can't completely end child abuse by making child abuse illegal, or spousal abuse, or sex slavery. These are all things where other human beings are victims of great injustice. And we as a community have made them illegal because for two reasons. Number one, we hope to limit that evil as much as possible and provide an enforcement arm within there so that we can not just say you can't do it, but so that there are repercussions for people that do these things. We want to limit evil as much as we can, knowing that we can never stop it, but we can hopefully limit it. And number two, the other reason is because laws are informative, they're educational. They teach us what's important to society. For example, which is an often used example, when I was young was when Mothers Against Driving Drunk started their campaign to stop drunk driving. This seemed outrageous to some people. Like, what are you going to do? Are you going to have road stops? Are you just going to stop people on the road and check them to see if they've been drinking? This sounds so intrusive. For something as trivial as drinking and driving, we all do it. And then, after the laws were passed, the threshold of having to be drunk was very high. The punishment for what happened was very low. But the laws taught us something important. They taught us the cost of driving drunk. They taught us that the community was against it. They taught us there was good reasons to be against it. And as we became more and more comfortable with the importance of not driving impaired and the cost in human lives that come with it, the level of impairment came lower and lower and lower. You could have drank, the level to which you could have drank before you got out on the road gets lower and lower, and the punishment for killing somebody gets higher and higher. The laws educated us and changed our attitude towards us. You see this, by the way, with the United Nations. Many years ago, the United Nations tried to pass an anti-spanking law. We're going to go with spanking as child abuse, and we want to pass a law that says that nobody in the United Nations, we're going to pass something that says that nobody in member states should be spanking their children. They acknowledged that they could never enforce this. But they said, by making it a rule for member nations, we will instruct and teach people on the wrongness of it and hopefully change their behavior. So you make it illegal if the unborn are one of us, because we have to limit the evil of their destruction and to inform society and educate the people that are living in society what is considered just and right in our community. Seeking the flourishing for all people, we protect all life. So the question isn't, will we stop all abortion by making it illegal? We all recognize that we won't. As a matter of fact, I have a quote here from Joseph Delapena in his book, Dispelling the Myths of Abortion History, this massive book that I have here, which is a great book, and it's quoted, by the way, a lot in the Dobbs versus Jackson decision by Justice Alito. He says, I take it as axiomatic that as long as there have been humans, there have been people who did not want to be burdened by a child and would seek to do whatever it took to be rid of an unwanted infant. We recognize that we can't stop it, which gets us to, so the first question is, what are the unborn? The second part is recognizing, how do we talk about it when we say abortion has always been around? It's always been there. It always will be. Okay, it's right. That's why I wanted to read Joseph Delapena's quote there. As long as there have been people getting pregnant, there's been people who didn't want to be pregnant and they've been willing to do terrible things. Desperate people willing to do desperate acts with terrible consequences. It's It's always been a part of the human experience. It always will be. So I agree. I concede. We will not end abortion. But the question, as I mentioned earlier, is what of the unborn? If the unborn are one of us, then we try to limit the evil of abortion and we instruct society through just laws. But let's look when we say abortion has always been there. Because it's not really true in the way that we're talking about today. Abortion has not always existed as it does today. Right? The way that it does today is being done by modern science. As a matter of fact, the overwhelming majority of abortions now that are being performed in the United States are being done by medical abortions. People taking mifepristone and misoprostol and they get it in the mail through telemedicine or through other organizations, and they take those pills. I think we're up to like 60. The last time I saw it was like 65, something. I can get the exact numbers and I'll have them in the article. But over 60% of abortions in the United States being done through the pill, which was made much easier during COVID because the Biden administration relaxed certain laws and made it possible for people to be able to prescribe this medicine through Zoom. And so that idea at that time was COVID, but they didn't relax them when COVID was over because they wanted it to be that way. And so now it's much easier to have that medicine shipped to you or mailed to you, even in the states that restrict the practice of abortion. So you think about abortion under modern ideas of abortion and the idea that, oh, well, it's always been there. I mean, yeah, but not like it is today. And one of the reasons, number one, and Joseph Della Pena talks about that in his book on infanticide. On his book on the Dispelling the Myths of Abortion History. One of the first things he talks about is, well, when abortion was dangerous, and it was, because any way that you could kill the unborn child threatened to kill the mother prior to the advent of medical science the way that we understand it today. I could give you certain volatile oils, poisons, that hopefully the balance of it is I would poison you just enough not to kill you, but to kill your unborn child inside of you. That's a pretty tricky thing to do when you're not operating on a principle of medical science and you don't understand how all of these things are working. Intrusive, like invasive things where we would go in and actually take the child out and kill them. Well, that was crazy dangerous because they didn't even understand the idea of antibiotics. They didn't understand bacteria. They didn't understand any of these concepts. And so they wouldn't have cleaned their instruments appropriately and they would have caused all sorts of death. As a matter of fact, Joseph Della Pena says that up until recent history, the attempts to administer abortion to yourself or to get abortion were considered an attempt of suicide. The connection between trying to kill your unborn and kill yourself was so high. So what did they do if they couldn't perform abortions the way that we did today? Well, they were infanticide. They would just leave them. And I've got this book by Tom Holland, the historian, not Spider-Man, his book called Dominion, where he talks about how the Christian Revolution remade the world. And in this book, he's talking about the idea of one of the things that we changed, that Christianity changed the world on, was the idea of exposure. He says, but there was a seed as well that fell on the good ground. Lepers and slaves were not the most defenseless of God's children. He talked about prior to this in this chapter, the idea that Christians for the first time were defending the least of these, the people who had the least power and the least stature in society. And they brought in this ethic that those people who would consider to be the least of these were the image bearers of God and ought to be treated with same dignity and respect as everybody else. And that just wasn't existent prior to them. This was the thing that they brought to culture that transformed the world. And as he's talking about in about 362, he's talking about the idea of Gregory and his work in trying to get the world to respect all life, even those lives that were inconvenient, even those lives that were seen to have less value. There was a seed as well that fell on the good ground. Lepers and slaves were not the most defenseless of God's children. Across the Roman world, wailing at the sides of roads or on rubbish tips, babies abandoned by their parents were a common sight. Others might be dropped down drains, there to perish in the hundreds. The odd, eccentric philosopher aside, few had ever queried this practice. Indeed, there were cities who by ancient law had made a positive virtue of it, condemning to death deformed infants for the good of the state. Sparta, one of the most celebrated cities in Greece, had been the epitome of this policy, and Aristotle himself had lent it to the full weight of his prestige. Girls in particular were liable to be winnowed ruthlessly. Those who were rescued from the wayside would invariably be raised as slaves. Brothels were full of women who as infants had been abandoned by their parents, so much so that it had long provided novelists with a staple of their fiction. Only a few people, the odd German tribe and inevitably the Jews, had stood aloof from the exposure of unwanted children. Pretty much everyone else had always taken it for granted until that was the emergence of the Christian people. I think, by the way, when I think of the contributions that Christianity has made to the world, the idea of Christian families rescuing exposed children from the hills left to die and raising them as their own, adopting them into their family, I think transforming society in that way so that what I just read ought to have sounded monstrous to you. What was taken for granted is just the way to deal with unwanted children by all of society around them, except for a few small queer groups, as he talks about. And then all of a sudden you've got a movement brought in through the love of God, the love of Christ, and the love of our fellow man through the great commandment to love our neighbors ourselves, to change the world. The good guys in that story, I think, are easy to see, right? The good guys are the people who rescued the children. And that's not the end of infanticide. By the way, it goes on through. Joseph Delapena talks about Jonathan Swift and his book and his writing, The Modest Proposal. If you've read his essay on A Modest Proposal, where he suggests that rather than leave their children out and dump them in rivers and kill them through the practice of infanticide, that they sell them for food so that people can eat them. So at least then we take care of people starving and giving them food. And at the same time, we create a monetary system where people are compensated for their children. This was satire, by the way, because he thought it was so horrifying what was going on, where they were finding just bodies of babies in the rivers that had been dumped there from people who did not want them. Infanticide was so much more the common way of dealing with things that we can track it. Infanticide in Western societies, as he talks about it, historical demography. This is from Joseph Delapena in his book, Dispelling the Myths of Abortion History. Historical demographers have identified sex ratios as high as 4-to-1 in favor of male children in areas of medieval Europe, meaning there are 4 times more male children than there were female children growing up in these societies in medieval Europe. Well, that doesn't happen naturally. Those are indications of infanticide of female children. And this is so common, by the way, that there are exposure laws in the United States, which means that there are laws against concealment laws, in the United States. You can't conceal the fact that you're pregnant from your community. And if you're found to be hiding your pregnancy, you will be prosecuted in violation of the law. Why would you have concealment laws? Because if you were concealing your pregnancy, there was a reason you were concealing your pregnancy. You intended to kill the baby when it was born. And these laws were on the books very late into U.S. history, very recently removed in some places. You can't hide the fact that you're pregnant, because the only people that are going to hide their pregnancy are the people that intend to do harm to their child when they're born. Infanticide, not abortion, was the way that we dealt with unwanted pregnancy throughout most of human history. And the people that fought to end it were a part of what, in Dominion, Tom Holland, who is not a Christian, is making the case that we're part of the greatest moral force the world has ever seen. Teaching the world to value each and every human life as the image bearers of God. So when we say abortion has always existed, we didn't have the medical capacity to perform abortions the way that we had starting in the mid-19th century. We started to grow at that point. But it didn't exist the way it does now. That's projecting the current day. That's projecting today back into history. And that's just a silly way to do it. Abortion hasn't always existed the way it exists today. But we have had a way of dealing with unwanted children. Now you may say, well, isn't this better? By the way, that's why, because of the idea of infanticide or the abandonment of children, that's why if you read Charles Dickens novels or 18th century and 19th century novels, there's so many orphanages, but we don't have the same number of orphanages today because the children were being born and abandoned. And there were people who opened up places, Christian people who opened up places so that we could take care of the abandoned children and raise them in an environment where they were valued and protected. So So abortion hasn't always existed the way it does today. Infanticide had existed prior to that, and we had means to take care of that. And the good guys were always the people that were fighting it. So if you say that abortion's an improvement on infanticide, that's just to assume that younger human beings have less value than older human beings, and there's no good reason to believe that. You've refined it, and I've actually written articles for this on Christian Research Journal where I acknowledged we're going to get better at abortion because we get better at everything. We're going to get more efficient. It's going to be safer for the woman seeking the abortion. It's just going to get easier and easier to perform abortions because we love our abortions and we refine our processes. It's easy to admit that. But no matter how good we get an abortion, it's still the unjust taking of an innocent human life. It cannot ever be sanitized by making it safer for those people performing abortions or those people getting abortions, because it's always the destruction of an innocent human life. That's why that first question is the most important question. What is that embryonic human? What is that fetal human? Are they one of us? But abortion hasn't always existed the way it did today because it was wildly dangerous through most of history, and there were easier ways to do the job. But now the next thing is added to this objection. They say, okay, if you get rid of abortion, not only will it continue to happen, but more people will die as a result of abortion. Well, number one, if the unborn are human in the same way that you and I are, we can't make it legal just to protect people from the terrible consequences of their desperate decisions. We've already conceded desperate people take desperate actions that lead to terrible consequences. And understanding their desperation, empathizing with the emotion that underlies their decision, does not provide moral justification. Just because I get your anxiety and fear about the future, just because I can empathize with your fear about finding out something that you didn't know yesterday, that there is a child already here, very early in its life, and that their existence is going to impact your own. Just because I get and can empathize with everything that you're feeling or going through does not provide moral justification for the action. It just means that I should, and the community ought to work to help you to overcome that fear and anxiety and to see the presence of this life as something good, not just for you, but for all of us, rather than a distraction or an impediment or a roadblock for you reaching your dreams, or something that even worse is going to destroy your life. That's a terrible way for you to see it. But the reason that you see it that way is because of the indifference of the community around you, possibly, or your fear of the indifference of the community around you. And we have a responsibility as a community to look for more hopeful answers. So as we're talking about that, though, if they're human, we can't allow you to kill them to protect you from the consequences of that decision. But let's look at the number of people that died. Let's take a brief, because what we hear is that it happened so widely, that there were just so many people that were dying of illegal abortions. And I'm not sure. I'm 100% sure that when they used the numbers 5 to 10,000 a year were dying every year, that number was made up. Bernard Nathanson, who was one of the doctors who fought for abortion rights, then later became pro-life in his approach to this, said, we made those numbers up. Those figures weren't based on anything. We absolutely made them up to manipulate emotionally the people of the United States so that they would get on our side. If they believed that 5 to 10,000 women a year were dying, then they would be motivated to join our side. Complete fabrication or made up. But you still see numbers all the time. So let's get the official numbers in the United States. All right. So we're looking at, and I'll link to this where I got these. According to the United States Bureau of Vital Statistics and the Centers for Disease Control, the last time 1,000 women died of illegal abortions in the United States was in the year before penicillin became widely available to the public in 1942. In the 10 years preceding Roe v. Wade, deaths ranged from 90 to 150 per year. By the way, each one of that 90 to 150 per year is a tragedy. It's horrifying to think that 90 to 150 women were dying a year of illegal abortions in the 10 years prior to Roe v. Wade. But it's not 5 to 10,000. And it doesn't justify killing over 1 million human beings every year through the practice of abortion to protect the 90 to 150 from the terrible consequences of their desperate decisions. Here are the years preceding up to it. 1968, 130. 1972, 90. 1973, 57. Now here we see abortion becoming legal, so we should expect the number of abortions to drop, right? Maternal deaths attributable to abortion, these are all deaths, not just illegal. 73, 57, 74, 54, 75, 49. 76, we see a big drop down to 27, 77 back up to 35. But what you see here is legal abortion hasn't ended maternal death. The same logic, by the way, that they're using on us. You can't make it legal enough to keep women from dying from it. To say nothing of the unborn lives that are being destroyed. But this is nothing like, and you may say, and then people have said to me, well, you know those figures are ultra conservatives, but this is the data that we have. This is what I have to work off of. This is the data that I have. If you're going to talk about all these other, these statistics that exist, but we don't have any data to support them, these numbers of mystery deaths, I don't know how I'm supposed to evaluate those. You're going to have to give me hardcore evidence that those things exist, because the data that I have is that the year before abortion was made legal, there were 90 deaths from all abortion in the United States, legal and illegal. 90 maternal deaths. Not 5,000 or 10,000, 90. Now, again, I don't want to minimize the importance of 90 people losing their lives. But if the unborn are human, that's 90 lives versus over 1 million lives destroyed through the practice of abortion. And we can't tell a group of people that you're allowed to kill 1 million human lives to protect 90 people from the terrible consequences of their desperate act. That's just not how we morally pass laws. That's not how we operate. That would be a crazy way to operate. We don't pass laws based on those kinds of extreme ideas. That would be like if well, let's not go into all that. Let's not trivialize it by comparing it to other things right now. Needless to say, when they say to us, abortion would not, or if we make abortion illegal, abortion will continue to exist as it's always existed, we have to recognize that it has not always existed as one thing. It has changed throughout all of human history. And as it exists today, which is mostly medical abortion through pills, is different than even as it existed 20 years ago. It changes all the time, and we refine the practice. But the question isn't whether abortion will continue to exist. The question is, are they unborn human? Are they one of us? And if they are, then we're going to pass laws to limit the evil as best we can to educate society. And when they say by extension, well, but their women are going to die, we can say, unfortunately, I think you're probably right. But women still do die during legal abortion. We cannot make abortion so legal that women won't die from it, apparently. So we have to decide what's the most just application of law, which takes us back to the question, what are the unborn? If the unborn are one of us, then we can't license the destruction of 1 million human lives so that we can save a much, much, much smaller number of people from the terrible consequences that are desperate acts. And finally, what I want to say is that if abortion is the unjust destruction of innocent human life, if the unborn are one of us, abortion should be hard to get. It should be. I understand I think Robert George said it as cleanly and clearly as anybody has ever said it. They want their abortions. My friend who has been trained by me and other people to talk about the issue of abortion came to me. He and I were talking about that one night. I said, at the end of the day, we can argue. It's our job is to argue, to defend life, to make the case that they're one of us, to make the case that the unborn are human, that they're a full member of the human family, to make the case to Christians that the unborn are the image bearers of God and ought to be treated with dignity and respect, and that our first priority is to love the Lord our God with all that we are and love our neighbor as ourselves. Not just love our neighbor as we love ourselves. And that the unborn is our neighbor. And we're obligated and duty bound to serve them as we would serve any of the least of us. But that if abortion is what I'm saying it is, then it ought to be really hard to get. You ought to have trouble finding abortion. There ought to be impediments up to you getting it. It should be difficult, and doctors who perform it should be punished. 100%. You want to argue about other things? That's fine. We can argue about other things. But on that particular one, I don't see any room to argue. If the unborn are fully human, the practice of restricting abortion is our basic duty and obligation to our fellow human beings. And that we have to find a more hopeful, more maybe sexually cautious existence on the other side of that doesn't bother me a whole lot. It's going to restrict your sexual practices. You're not going to be able to have consequences-free sex with whoever you want. Guess what? You never could. Sex is an immensely complicated thing, and it brings with it all sorts of emotional, psychological, spiritual complication in addition to disease and pregnancy. There's no such thing as uncomplicated sex. It's a pipe dream. It's a wish. There's no such thing as consequence-free. There's as many unicorns out there as there is consequence-free sex. There are victims of this search for consequence-free sex. It doesn't exist. And so if your greatest grievance is that you're going to have to exert a little bit more sexual self-control if we tell you that you're not allowed to kill other human beings. And I see these ridiculous arguments from the other side online. If you're going to outlaw abortion, then you should make it necessary for the man to take care of any child that comes into existence as a result of his sexual practice with a woman. Done. I'm all for that, right? And that's another person, like, if you're going to do it, then they ought to have to be there long term. They ought to be invested in the life of that baby. They ought to have to be there to help raise that child. You're talking about marriage. Done. I'm with you on that too. We have an accord. We've reached an agreement that if we get rid of abortion, which we ought to do, then we are going to have a society that takes sex more seriously, is more sober about who you get involved with, and when you create children, has a greater responsibility to raise them. I am on your side. Done. Agreed. Abortion ought to be hard, but limiting it ought to require from us a greater recognition of the importance of family and society and our responsibilities and duties to the next generation. We should not be free to kill our children before they're born. We should be there to raise them, love them, and take care of them. They're the most important thing that you will leave this world. That is the great thing. This is what I'll end on. That is a great thing, I think, about the point of view that we get from the book of Ecclesiastes. This view, our wisdom, our riches, our success, our notoriety, our fame, our power, it's all transient. A generation from now, almost nobody will remember us. Nobody will even know we were here. But the people we leave the world, if we can instill in them principles that will survive us and that they will pass to the next generation and the next. Love the Lord your God. Love your neighbor as yourself. Then we can transform the world with that. My kids are my greatest legacy. Not anything that I do professionally. No matter how professionally accomplished we are, we will be forgotten sooner or later. Our riches will fade. Our fame will end. It will all go. Ecclesiastes tells us it's all dust in the wind. It's nothing. Nothing. So love God and keep his commandments, because all the rest of the things you're pursuing are transient, momentary things that will never last beyond you. If they last with you, which most people don't, right? I mean, we've all seen the VH1 specials when we were growing up, right? About the singer who was wildly famous and then now nobody knows who they are, right? People were freaking out and screaming every time they saw them walking down the street, and women crying, young girls weeping at their presence, and now they're like working at Best Buy or something like that and planning their comeback, right? It's all fleeting. It's all nothing. But the people in our lives are the image bearers of God, and our children are our legacy. All right, one more episode, and then we're going to do an election special. I think we're going to do an election special. We're going to have a series of specials. So I'm going to start on season 4 necessarily. We're going to do a care like one-offs that are all like just like we're going to focus on one thing today before we launch into season. But we have an election special coming up. So this was season 3, episode 9, Merely Human Ministries, Human Things. Thank you so much for tuning in. Hey, share it if you like it. Go to our website, Human Things, or merelyhumanministries.org. Look for our Substack. Look for our Substack. Because what we talked about here at the end, I will have a written, not a transcript of what I said, an actual article written about what we just talked about here. The idea of that abortion has to remain legal, and of law, making it illegal wouldn't stop it. So we'll have a whole section, a whole Substack written on that, and it'll be up on our Substack in the next couple of days. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time.